Okay, it's 6 p.m. sharp. Welcome everyone to this Twitter space on EUvsDisinfo channel in conversation with Bill Browder. Bill, we're so happy to have you with us. Thank you for coming.
Good to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
We appreciate that. So my name is Martyna Bildziukiewicz. I'm head of East Stratcom Task Force, which is behind the EUvsDisinfo project, and I'm here with my team colleague Madeleine Lerup, and we have the pleasure of talking to you for give or take half an hour. So if you don't mind, I'll actually kick right off. So Bill, we have been admiring your work for many years, and you have a long history of raising awareness of aberrations, if I may call it that, of Russian state. And the Kremlin went after you numerous times. So given what we are also focusing on in our work, which is disinformation, information manipulation from the Kremlin, we were thinking that we could start by you giving us an example of when you had to face a disinformation campaign directed at you, and how this happened, and what was your response?
Well, I face a disinformation campaign which is happening as we speak. Every minute of every day, there's something going on from Russia. They have as you probably know, they have this troll factory in St. Petersburg, and I would imagine that there's like a whole, sort of floor or corner devoted to causing trouble for me. So what kind of things do they do? Uh, so if you wanted to say something nice about me on Twitter, this is an interesting experiment. I encourage any of you to do it just for fun. You put out a tweet saying Bill Browder is so good, and then watch your timeline fill up with all these trolls coming out of nowhere that are all saying Bill Browder is a criminal. Bill Browder is he raped Russia. He's a terrible man. He's a convicted convict. Blah 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 blah. Um, and this goes on and on and on every day. And it's very interesting because there are certain times when it's not happening, which is like I guess there are certain working hours at the troll factory and certain certain hours when they're not working. And so um, my timeline can be all normal except when it gets all when the troll factory is at work and when they have their assignment and so on. And it's also very interesting because on certain issues they're more exercised than other issues. And so, for example, the one of my big projects recently has been to advocate for the freezing of the 350 billion, or actually the seizing of the 350 billion dollars of Russian central bank reserves, which have been frozen. And this is, of course, something which is really a sensitive topic for the Kremlin. And so you'll have all sorts of stuff in my timeline about that. So it's an ongoing process of, and of course, this is just one of many things. They've made movies about me. They've hired public relations firms in London and in New York to go around and pitch nasty articles about me. The government officials make public statements about me, and so it's all basically an effort to try to reduce my credibility in the eyes of Western parliaments and governments so that my advocacy work against Putin doesn't succeed.
Yes, we also know several examples from your books about how those for example, movies when they were shown, they were also facing quite a lot of pushback, which is good. But maybe you can also elaborate a little bit, if you don't mind, about what you did in response to those disinformation campaigns that were targeting you directly. And if I may bring it to an even more personal level, how did it affect you? How did you deal with that?
Well, so let's take the movie. So back in 2016, I believe it was, there was a guy. His name was Andrei Nekrasov, and Andrei Nekrasov had a history of being a documentary filmmaker that made movies about sort of critical of Putin. He apparently had been effectively on the payroll of Boris Berezovsky, who had had been anti-Putin, and so this guy Nekrasov had made a bunch of, I think maybe 3 or 4 movies that were highly critical of Putin. And he was also the boyfriend of a member of the European Parliament and a woman who was head of the committee on human rights subcommittee on the European Parliament. And so she said, "Oh, you should meet my boyfriend. He's a movie maker. He can make a really good movie about Sergei Magnitsky and so on and so forth." And so so I thought this guy is fully vouched for because of his connection with Heidi Hautala, this MEP, and and he has this great track record of making very powerful anti-Putin movies. And so we started to work with him, and and the first sort of 3 interviews were all sort of pretty legit, all about the murder of Sergei Magnitsky and so on and so forth. And then the fourth interview, he shows up and he basically starts interviewing me as if he is a FSB officer with the full FSB sort of narration of how, or sort of spin on all of my activities. And I was sort of confused and a bit shocked by the questions he was asking. It was all on camera, and I kind of said, well, where's this coming from? This is pretty odd. If you're making a movie using this narrative, it's going to sort of blow back on you. And I stopped the interview, and then about a year and a half later, I get this call from somebody at the European Parliament who said, "Do you realize that this movie is about to be shown in the European Parliament, hosted by Heidi Hautala, which is going to just attack your credibility, Sergei Magnitsky's credibility. It's going to say that Sergei Magnitsky wasn't murdered, that he died of natural causes, that he and you are fraudsters, that in your whole campaign is just a smokescreen to cover up your own illegal activities in Russia." And I was amazed and shocked by the whole thing, and I didn't have much time to prepare a response to it. And the thing about it is, somebody makes a 1 hour movie, um, you need to make a 1 hour response. And normally, in these types of situations, uh, I can only, I could put a PowerPoint together or something like that. But he had this full movie, and uh, and so in this particular case, we wrote to the European Parliament. We wrote to the producers of the movie. I and We gave them the sort of, here's all the information you need to like dispute all this nonsense that he's saying. Sergei Magnitsky's family wrote to all these people, and in the end, the European Parliament dropped it at the very last minute. Interestingly, the people who uh, were in the movie, some of them were the actual criminals involved in sort of persecuting Sergei Magnitsky before he died. They actually had showed up at the European Parliament to sort of be a part of this whole sort of masquerade. And uh, and in the end, it wasn't shown at the European Parliament. They then tried to show it at a thing called the Newseum in Washington. And the Newseum in Washington is this. It's the Museum of Free Speech. And when we tried to get it shut down there, they pushed back very hard, and they ended up showing it. And interestingly, I probably shouldn't have been so concerned about it, because when all the audience came, and the audience consisted of all sorts of Russians and Russian dissidents and people who knew the story very well, they all they all sort of took matters into their own hands, and at the end of the movie there was massive booing, and then a full, and when the discussion took place, a full attack on this guy Nekrasov, and the whole thing kind of blew up in his face. But it was all pretty upsetting to me, first and foremost because they were defaming Sergei Magnitsky, who was a hero and a victim, and to try to like sort of make him into a culprit was really pretty awful. And it was just so cynical and so evil, and so much was invested in this whole thing. They spent a lot of money on the movie and a lot of money on promoting it, and they got like a big PR firm and a lobbying firm in Washington to assist them. And it was all just really kind of unbelievable and that this was basically a Russian government operation taking place in Washington and in Brussels, and trying to succeed in this whole thing.
Yes, thank you so much. I would like to continue a little bit on the topic of disinformation. Obviously, you have a lot of experience, a lot of personal experience of this. You have been talking about these issues for many, many years. I think you will agree with us that we do see an increased awareness of Russian disinformation now. But do you think that we are more resilient now than we were a few years ago? And do you think that, and if you agree that we are, do you think it will stay with us? Do you think there will be changes in the coming years?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say whether we're more resilient or not. I mean, like Twitter, I think had sort of put up various guardrails to protect from all this kind of stuff, and then Twitter got taken over by Elon Musk, and he's putting the guardrails down. And so all of a sudden, like it used to be that you knew who was like a legitimate person and who wasn't based on their blue stars next, blue check marks next to their name. And so if someone had a blue check mark, you knew that they were like, a journalist or a government official or, a corporate executive or someone real, verified, etc. And now all of a sudden, anyone could pay $8 for a check mark, and those people could put out all sorts of nonsense, and so it's all very confusing. Who's saying what and who's not saying what, and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, Twitter, in a certain sense, has become worse since all this, since I guess since Elon Musk took over. Having said that, at the same time, I think everybody now understands that Russia is, Putin and Russia are Russia's effectively a criminal regime, and Putin is a mass murderer, and so effectively anything that comes out of Russia is suspect, which is good for anything official that comes out of Russia. But then you have all these sort of intermediaries that are spouting their nonsense, which is not official Russian stuff. So how do you categorize a statement from Tucker Carlson or Marjorie Taylor Greene, who are all parroting the same stuff? And what is their motivation? Are they doing it? Why are they doing it? Are they doing it, for their own political reasons, or do they have some kind of background connected to the Russian government? It's all very strange and unhelpful, and then people who hear this stuff, like I was on a show the other night here in the UK. It was on a Piers Morgan, who's a big commentator, talk show guy, had me on his show, and to talk about tanks. This was when the Germans were sort of hesitating on supplying tanks to Ukraine, and I was on the show to talk about tanks for Ukraine, and it was interesting because Piers Morgan was also very much on the side of giving the tanks to Ukraine, and then they got this woman to be to be the debater on the other side. Her name was Tony Lahren. She comes from Fox News, and she got on this show, and she said, no, we shouldn't give anything to Ukraine. No tanks for Ukraine. This is terrible. Why are we worrying about the Ukrainian border when we have to worry about the southern border? And she made it appear as if she represented some like large swathe of American voters, which isn't true. I mean, Americans don't particularly not want to supply tanks to Ukraine, but and 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 how does anyone verify who does she represent? Why is she saying this? How many people are behind her? Because from my perspective, and I think I've done enough work to know this, she represents this fringe of the far right of the Republican Party that doesn't have any particular widespread following at all. But if she continues to repeat this over and over again on Fox News and any other station that takes her, and she says, "I'm speaking on behalf of families and housewives in America that don't want this money to be spent in Ukraine," some people might actually think that that's what a lot of you know people in America think, and if they think that, then it becomes part of the political landscape that might have not otherwise been there.
So can I ask you how do you think we should deal with that kind of thing? Like when we hear this kind of Russian talking points not coming from necessarily official Russian sources, but coming from someone else, someone who you might not know, as you said, who's behind it, anonymous kind of opinions. How can we deal with that?
Well, I think it's not easy. I mean, so in when we were fighting on the Magnitsky stuff, it was in a certain way easier because we knew who the characters were. There weren't that many of them. We could then do research into their backgrounds. We could expose who they were, what their connections were. Sometimes data leaked about them, which put them in really a negative light, and so on and so forth. But I think it requires, that we're at war. There's a physical war going on, and there's an information war that's going on. And the people who are issuing the false information, we need to dedicate resources to discovering, outing, exposing these people. And it requires resources. We can't just sit back and accept it. We have to really look hard. Somebody should do an investigation into what are the finances of Tony Lahren? Why is she saying all these Russian talking points? She lives in Tennessee. Where did she come up with this stuff? You know, I'd like to know. I think a lot of people would like to know.
I'm sure a lot of people would like to know, indeed. So I want to say two things in comment to what you've been sharing with us. First of all, if, in terms of investigations, there is a fantastic study by an Ukrainian organization called Texty that is investigating organizations promoting Ruski Mir all across Europe. And I hope they will be able also to extend the study to other continents. Really, really worth reading. It's publicly available online. Texte is the name of the organization. But what I also want to say is that, what we are witnessing right now in terms of disinformation and information manipulation is something that Russia has had in its playbook for a really long time, using topics that are already there in the public discussion. It's not like Russia is inventing all of those topics that divide us. And this narrative about not sending tanks to Ukraine, for example, or in a broader sense, the narrative about peace is a very sneaky one, I think, and one of the most spread these days. So in theory, we all want peace, of course, right? We prefer peace than
Of
war.
course.
But when Russia says, of course, right?
Yeah.
But when Russia says peace, it actually means lack of territorial integrity for Ukraine, lack of sovereignty for Ukraine. So this is a completely twisted world that Russia is trying to portray, to show us here.
It is indeed, and this peace one. Thank you for bringing that up. It's infuriating. So if you describe it in the real way, what they want is for 150 more buchas and I, anytime Russia takes over a part of Ukraine, they, dig shallow graves and put people, and tie people's hands behind their backs and shoot them in the head if they're men, and then rape them if they're women, and then kill them. And for these people to say we want peace, it's just we want we want the mutilation and rape of innocent Ukrainians. That's the translation.
Exactly. This may be a good time to actually talk, perhaps, and ask you about Russia in general and its future, actually. So I saw that last week you joined Russians protesting in London against Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And obviously you've known Russia inside and out for a very long time. What would you say is the role of disinformation in Russia, in the Russian society right now? And do you see a shift as compared to several years ago, 10 years ago, more even? And what has changed with the war?
Well, one of the things I was at this demonstration in London last weekend, which was organized by the Russian opposition in front of the Russian embassy, and it was really well attended. There was, I think, I don't know, 700-800 people there, which was a lot of people for Russians to stand up in front of the embassy, and the Russians that were there were, just as fully educated about the atrocities as anybody, and they were more strident than anybody I've ever heard. They were calling Putin a mass murderer, calling Putin a war criminal, demanding the withdrawal from Russian troops from Ukraine, etc. And so these people were all well versed, well educated, and their hearts were in the exact right place. Um, and but it's so strange to see then these interviews on Twitter or television where they go out and they start speaking to people in Moscow who are all just like frothing at the mouth with anger towards Ukrainians when the Ukrainians have done nothing. And I don't know whether that represents a large portion of Russian society or not. I'd like to think not, but you read these surveys that say that 80% of the people support the war in Ukraine. Um, I've also had an interesting interaction with a Russian journalist. I was interviewed today by a famous Russian journalist who was wanted to like probe me about sanctions, and the big question was, do you think it's fair that like average Russians are under sanctions? And I said I think it's really a kind of a low priority issue to worry about whether Russian people feel fair to be under sanctions when Ukrainians are being mutilated and bombed and killed on a daily basis. 9/11 type terrorism is taking place daily in Ukraine. It's like, so someone can't, use their iPhone is hardly something I care about. And it was really interesting how emphatic this journalist was about, that most Russians, they don't like what's going on, but they don't want to get put in jail, and they just want to keep their head down. And my point was, you kind of have to take sides here. You can't just like hope that your life is going to be normal when such an atrocity is being perpetrated on a neighboring country in your country's name, and you're not standing up to the leader of your country. And it is really interesting and complicated to try to understand what creates public opinion in Russia. And I really don't understand it anymore because it's all so weird, feverish, full of misinformation, etc.
Yes, we would also like to hear your opinion a little bit about the accountability. There are a lot of talks about, having an international tribunal and making Russia pay for this war, basically. But there's also the financial side. You have been advocating for seizing Russian assets. Could you talk a little bit more about how best to do that? How do you see it realistically being done?
Well, so first of all, there's two huge parts of this whole huge conditions, I should say, um, of how this thing has to end. The first condition that is that the Russia has to withdraw from all territory that's taken illegally, not just on February 24th, but as coming back to 2014. And the second is that Russia has to take responsibility for the crimes that were committed and the damage that was done. And that means that individuals have to face trial for crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and other atrocities. And the country has to take responsibility for the crime of aggression, and they have to pay reparations equal to the damages that were done. And it's that's obviously these are very ambitious targets that Putin is um, obviously gonna he's pushing back very hard on. But these are the conditions, the only conditions in which things could ever normalize with Russia. And so what does this mean? Is it means that in the short term we need to start coming up with these mechanisms. We need to come up with the war crimes prosecutions, and we need to come up with the special tribunal to try Putin um, and the Russian state for the crime of aggression. And all these things are being worked on by some very important and good lawyers, and I think progress will be made. And on the financial side, and this is something that's a big priority for me and something that I'm working on very hard, is that we've been able to calculate $1.2 trillion of damages that was done to the Russian economy, or I mean to the Ukrainian economy from this whole thing. And we have since the first week of the war, we have seized or frozen, I should say, $350 billion of Russian central bank reserves, and it seems to me to be entirely morally right, financially right, and politically right that we need to put together a mechanism in order not just to have frozen these $350 billion, but to seize it and to use it for the defense and reconstruction of Ukraine. And this idea has a lot of popularity among the financial circles, and it's extremely unpopular among what I would call the bureaucratic diplomatic circles. Most bureaucrats and diplomats in foreign countries um, sort of shudder at the idea that one could just confiscate the money of Russia. They don't like it, not because they like Russia, but they don't like it because uh, it's never been done before. So oftentimes countries will pay reparations after they've been defeated, but it's rare or unheard of that it happens before the end of the war. Um, but in this case, I think it needs to be done before the end of the war because then, as time goes on, this war becomes more and more expensive, and as time goes on, uh, less people want to pay for it, and so it comes down to this concept of sovereign immunity. Um, Basically, Russia's central bank reserves at the moment are protected by sovereign immunity, which means that in the same way as the embassy is sovereign territory, the Russian embassy in London is sovereign territory, the Russian central bank reserves of the Bank of England are also sovereign property and can't be touched. And so Putin is going out and committing these horrific crimes, mass murder of Ukrainians, of Ukrainian civilians, and then sitting back and saying, but you can't touch my money because it's protected by sovereign immunity. And it just seems to me that if he's redefining international crime, we have to then redefine international law. And so my proposal, which I'm trying to gain momentum on, is to have the laws in a number of important G7 countries amended to say that sovereign immunity is generally sacrosanct, except when a country has committed and been found guilty for committing for the crime of aggression, and in that case, that the damages that were created by the crime of aggression should not be protected by sovereign immunity, and therefore the Russian central bank reserves could be frozen on that basis. Um, some people say this is like an impossible task, but these were the same people who were saying that getting the Magnitsky Act passed was an impossible task, and we have now gotten the Magnitsky Act passed in 35 countries. And so this is my big project, and I think it's something that's really next to the weapons for Ukraine is probably the next most important thing, which is the money for Ukraine.
Thank you so much. I think several very good points and very inspiring to hear that, things might sound like they're impossible, but let's work to try to do them anyway. Being mindful that we don't have a lot of time, I want to ask you one more question quickly. So you can see kind of the history of the relations between the EU, the so-called West, and Russia. What could we have done differently in the past to try to limit the situation that we have today, and what can we learn from those mistakes that we have made? A very big question,
No,
but
it's
maybe
very
if you can give a relatively
it's
brief
very
answer.
straightforward, which is that we just gave Russia, Putin, a free pass for 22 years. He invaded Georgia. We didn't do anything. He took Crimea. We didn't do anything. He carpet bombed Aleppo. We didn't do anything. He sent assassins to kill Sergei Skripal. We didn't do anything. And so he's had this impression that we're also narrowly focused on our own financial interests, that we weren't going to do anything. And every time anyone does any major action, they look at the benefits and the costs. And he saw huge political benefits for invading Ukraine, and he thought that the costs would be much less. And if we had done something differently in the past, if we had imposed the type of crippling sanctions we've imposed now after he did Crimea or after Aleppo or after something, um, he might have had a different calculation about what he was going to do on February 24th last year. And so I think that the lesson is that appeasement just ends up costing you much, much more in the long run. And this, I think, is really an important lesson for China, and it's also a lesson for how we go forward with Putin. It's not, if we give him any kind of reward for what he's done, there's all these ideas about, well, let's do a ceasefire and negotiate. Anything other than a total expulsion from Ukraine is a reward for what he's done. And if he has that reward, he'll just keep on trying to do it again. And so I think that the only option with Vladimir Putin is to be absolutely tough, strident, and totally uncompromising in this situation because he doesn't understand anything other than a boot on the throat.
Yes, indeed, it took 20 years and a very brutal war of aggression, but I hope at least now we learned our lesson. And really to conclude, we are very mindful of how busy you are, Bill. But to conclude, I would like to go back to your personal experience and just ask you, how do you motivate yourself to keep fighting the good fight? How do we all keep the fight for Ukraine's freedom and ours alive?
Well, the motivation for me was the tragic, horrible guilt that I felt for the murder of Sergei Magnitsky. He was killed because he worked for me. He was killed because he it's effectively was my proxy, and he died at the age of 37. He would have had another 50 years of life with his family, and I that every day that I think about that from 13 years ago until today, it both breaks my heart and infuriates me, and it drives me to do whatever I need to do to keep on fighting for justice. And he was one victim, we were one set of victims, and now that has been multiplied by hundreds of thousands with the war in Ukraine. And I think that it's very easy to be motivated when you watch this war in Ukraine and you understand the evil of the whole thing and just the terrible, terrible injustice of regular people just being mutilated by these bombs and by these attacks. And I think it's very easy not to lose one's motivation here because it's just so infuriating and so unjust.
Thank you very much for this, Bill. I want to conclude by bringing up something that you mentioned before. So you said that many people say, well, seizing Russian assets is not an easy thing to do because it's never been done before. But as you mentioned yourself, those exact words were said when you were trying to push for Magnitsky Act. And we have heard those exact words so many times over the last year when it's never been done before that we helped out a country at war. It's never been done before that we sent tanks to a country that is brutally attacked, and so on and so forth. I hope this will also be a case that it's never been done before until it has been done.
Indeed.
Let's all wish for this to happen. Bill, thank you so much for taking the time. It was a real pleasure. The recording of our conversation will be available on our Twitter, and we will also follow up on EU versus Disinfo website with a written interview. Bill, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.